Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's North Carolina Botanical Garden Lunchbox Talk. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas, and I'm the Director of Education here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we bring you Gary Perlmutter, who will be talking about lichens of North Carolina. We'd like to thank our Spring 2021 Lunchbox Talk event hosts, Sims Preston and Olympia Stone, for supporting our Spring Lunchbox Talk series at the Dogwood level. Lunchbox Talk event hosts provide funds that support program planning for reaching a broad and diverse audience, including support for captioning recorded talks that are made available to the public. Now we're ready to move forward to introduce our speaker. I had a preview of Gary's presentation last week, and you are in for a real treat of the eyes and the mind. Gary will have some questions for you. He'll be taking Q&A a couple of times during the session and at the end. So now let me introduce Gary Perlmutter as an associate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Herbarium. He first became interested in lichens and lichenology while studying at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden as an independent researcher in 1996. Gary took his skills, curiosity, and starter collection of about 25 specimens from a lichen workshop he taught at Santa Barbara to North Carolina, where he's been active in collecting, studying, and teaching lichen classes and workshops since he arrived here in 2003. Gary is an alumnus of our Botanical Garden, North Carolina Botanical Garden Native Plant Studies Certificate Program. He completed the certificate in 2009, and his final project was for that certificate was Piedmont Lichen Inventory. In 2016, Gary earned a Master's of Science degree from North Carolina State University, with his thesis being Assessing Highway Pollution Effects on Forest Lichen Communities in Western Wake County, North Carolina. Gary has published several papers in peer-reviewed journals and newsletters, and we are grateful for his work managing the lichen collection at our own UNC Herbarium. So Gary, thank you so much for being here with us today, and now I'll hand it off to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Joanna, and welcome everyone to this Lunchbox Talks today. I really don't have much to add to the introduction since Joanna said pretty much everything there is to say about my interest in history and lichenology here. So without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin the presentation. There we are. So as you can tell, the title of my talk is Lichens in North Carolina, Biology, Distribution, and Conservation. This has been put together by myself as well as my wife, Dr. Amy Rivas Plata, who got her doctorate in the University of Chicago, Illinois, and also did quite a bit of lichen work through the Chicago Field Museum. So we're going to start, as we don't often do with other organisms, with the basic question, what exactly is a lichen? And through time, our understanding of what lichens are has changed as we have learned more about lichen biology. So in the beginning, early concepts were that lichens were first believed to be plants, such as they're related to mosses. And it wasn't really until the 1800s that scientists have recognized that lichens really were more closely related to fungi. And then in the mid-1800s, Schwendener had developed a dual hypothesis, which is that lichens are a symbiotic organism comprising of both a fungus and an alga. So therefore, this traditional concept of the lichen being a symbiotic organism of two partners has held sway for about 100 years. And basically what it is that you have the fungus, which is called a mycobiont, and you have a photosynthesis, and that can either consist of an algae or a cyanobacterium. But more recently, through modern research and molecular investigations, we found out that lichens are a bit more complex than originally thought. Not only do we have the primary partners being the microbiont and the photobiont, but we found out that there are other fungi that are growing within the lichen thallus, both within and on top and on the lichen thallus. And also there are bacterial colonies that grow on them. So therefore we consider lichens as meta-organisms. Looking at the primary symbiosis, uh, it was found out that when grown in culture, the primary partners, being the fungus and alga, um, are develop into very, very different organisms, and they don't look a thing like the lichen itself. Lichens have been very, it's been rather difficult for lichens to be reconstituted from their individual parts, and it's probably because certain environmental conditions need to be right for the alga and for the fungus to hook up together, share information, and therefore develop the lichen thallus. So looking at the primary partners, the fungus or the microbiome is also known as the X-habitat. In other words, they are the outside of the lichen. And most lichens are considered involving sac fungi, that is the Ascomycota. However, there are a few mushroom lichens out there in the world as well. However, with the algal partner, the photobiont diversity is a bit more diverse. And while most of them involve green algae, that is chlorophyta, we do have about 10% of lichen species, including cyanobacterium as their photobiont. There are also trace amounts of species that harbor heterocontophytes, that is golden algae, or phaeophytes, brown algae, as their photosynthesizing partners, and those are primarily restricted to shorelines and intertidal zones. So looking more at the photobiont diversity, we have two major forms, either the green algae or the cyanobacteria. And among the green algae, we have this one elongated form called Trentipolia, and it is consisted of chains of cells, and they contain orange bodies. So these also give lichens somewhat of a different coloration, not necessarily whitish, but they could have a medallion looking somewhat orangish. Tribauxia is probably the most common green alga photobiont for lichens, whereas with cyanobacteria, we have quite a bit more species involved, such as nostoc, uh, Cyctonema, Heterococcus, and others. In some cases, there are lichens that harbor two photobionts, both a green alga and a cyanobacteria, and these are considered tripartite lichens. That means they have three parts. They can come in two forms, either a otherwise green algal lichen would harbor little pockets of cyanobacteria in bodies called cephalodia. And in that case, the cyanobacteria function as nitrogen fixers, whereas the green algae do the photosynthesis. There's another situation in which some lichens can alternate between a green algal form and a cyanobacterial form. And these are called chimera lichens. And they have been shown in certain environmental conditions to swap dominance, also called photosymbionts. In a study in a canyon, it was found out dominant lichen forms was found more predominantly in the upper part of the canyon where there's greater sunlight, whereas deeper in the canyon, under low light conditions, they are dominated by the cyanomorphs of the same species. Now, looking into the actual interactions between the fungi and algae, as I said before, the algae provide the foodstuffs for the fungus, and the fungus provides the shelter for the algae. So it's kind of a partnership in that regard. At a cellular level, the carbohydrates which the algae produce via photosynthesis are taken up by they would if they were free living in the soil and taking up nutrients directly from the soil. So instead of the soil, they take it from the algae. Recently, in 2012, it was found that certain lichens harbor entire bacterial communities that are unique uh, to these lichens. And in fact, there were some types of bacteria that were new to science as a result. It's been since that time discovered that these bacterial communities somewhere reflect the bacterial biota of the surrounding environment, but they are more concentrated in certain types within the lichen thallus. So in other words, as a lichen grows, it picks and chooses different bacteria from the environment and harbor the little microbiota that way. So continuing on, we also know that there are other fungi that grow within the lichen consortium, and this is considered the lichen biome. We have two types of fungi, the lichenicolous fungi that grow on the lichen, and then we have the endolichenic fungi that grow within the lichen. And while the lichenicolous fungi had been known for quite some time and can be identified to species in their own right, endolichenic fungi have only been discovered via DNA screening. And previously, they were thought to be contaminants in the thallus. Okay, there we go. And then even more recently, in 2016, Toby Spribille out of the University of Montana has discovered yet another partner to the lichen consortium. And what he found was that there are two species of horsehair lichen, a brown version that is edible and a yellow version that is toxic. And so he wanted to investigate the genetics of these two species and found out that the microbiont is actually the same species. The difference between the two lies in this new yeast partner that was found inhabiting the cortex or upper layer of the lichen. And what's interesting is that this came out as a great discovery and it upended the understanding of lichens that was once thought in the traditional sense as just being two partners with just one fungus. So another thing that they found out was that the Basidiomycete yeasts also contribute to uh, the chemistry of the lichen, and they are helping to produce the toxicity in the yellow lichen, thereby providing a means of herbivore deterrence. So since we know that lichens comprise of all sorts of different types of organisms, um, the name, how do we name them? So we name them only by the microbiont. So in other words, a lichen is considered a lichenized fungus, lichenized fungus. And so in at one time when taxonomists were considering how to classify lichens, there was an attempt to classify a lichen by both its fungal and algal partners. And that came into a really long naming system, and it was just unwieldy and not very usable. So then the agreement was made to just focus on the fungal component in taxonomy. So with this, we have a question. So what do you think exactly is a lichen? Would it be a moss, a fungus and alga, or a amendment organism? And can we stop for a question period?
Sure, that sounds great. If anybody has any questions, please type them into the Q&A. And we have a few people typing their answer to your question in the chat. And we've got a couple answers for letter C,
Great.
a meta-organism.
Excellent. Okay.
Looks like people have been paying attention.
Okay, great.
Does anybody have any questions for Gary at this time? Got a question for you. How can you cultivate lichen in captivity?
That's a very good question. I have not attempted that myself, but I would believe that what you would need to do is to somehow separate the fungus from the alga. And I think how that can be done is by going into the reproductive structures, and such as in a fruiting body, you can take sections of the fruiting bodies and you can isolate spores. And if you're able to isolate a spore, you can be able to grow that on a medium, and from there it can grow into a the microbiont culture.
Fascinating. All right, we've got a couple more questions. Someone would like a reminder about what the cyano part does.
Right. And the cyanobacteria can function in one of two ways. It can be a photosynthesizer, providing foodstuffs to the microbiota, or it can serve as a nitrogen fixer. That is converting unusable nitrogen from the environment, primarily from the air, to usable forms for metabolic uses.
All right. We've got another question. Is there an easy lichen key?
That is a very good question. Lots of lichens can be determined on site. However, many more lichens need to be determined through chemical or microscopic means. I would recommend, if you have it available, get the recent key by Erwin Brodo called "The Keys to the Lichens of North America," and revised and expanded. And this came out in 2016, because when the book Lichens of North America came out in 2011, there's been a lot of activity and research since then, and therefore a lot of names have changed.
Great.
That key should be available online. So just Google lichen keys.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Is nostoc now considered a lichen?
No, nostoc is the photobiont within certain cyanolichen species.
All right.
But in its free, however, I should note that algae can exist in a free state, and as such, then they are just algae. They are not lichens. It is when they interact with the fungus and they form the lichen thallus that they are considered part of the lichen.
Will you tell us why lichen sometimes smells so deliciously, especially if it's a bit wet and the sun shines on it?
I haven't run into that, but that's a very good question. Lichens are known to produce all sorts of chemicals, primarily for herbivore defense. And so I would think that the odors would be coming from the lichen substances that are produced by the fungus. So I would say it'd be analogous to, chemicals produced by plants, hence our spices.
All right. Are there any animals that feed exclusively on lichens?
Not that I know of, but I know many animals do eat lichens, insects, snails, slugs, and of course, there are reindeer that subsist on lichens in the far north, and hence there are some lichens that are literally called reindeer lichens because reindeer eat them.
Right, that's all the questions we have at the moment. I'm sure we'll get a few more as we go.
Okay, well, let's continue on then. Okay, there we go. So lichens, as we know, vary quite a bit in morphology and habitats. In morphology, we have quite a number of different types of growth forms, and each of these growth forms have their own description or descriptive term. And the three primary ones are crustose, crust-like, foliose, leaf-like, and fruticose or shrub-like. We also have some other forms such as squamulose that are shingle-like, dimorphic, which consists of two forms, a primary thallus, which is either squamulose or crustose, and then you have these erect stalks, often called podicia. And finally, we have pendulous or hanging growth forms. Lichens are also known to grow on all sorts of surfaces, and each of these surfaces have their own special term too. So they are found to grow on rocks, soil, bark, moss, wood, and even leaves, and on some unusual substrates, such as pine cones, glass bottles, roadways, cars, and even tortoises. So if you stood around long enough and provide a stable substrate, you too could be inhabited by lichens. And lichens are also known to grow all over the earth. They are found in just about every terrestrial habitat and a few aquatic ones, including those along the shoreline and near creeks. And not only are they able to survive in Earth's harshest conditions, but also in space. There was a experiment conducted by the European Space Agency where they put in a couple species of lichens onto the outer hull of the International Space Station. They left them out there for a period of 2 weeks, and then they brought them back to Earth, re-wetted them, and they came back to life as if nothing happened. And this is because lichens, when they undergo harsh environmental conditions, they just shut down and they go into kind of like a torpor or a slowed metabolic system. And that way they can just survive for ages until environmental conditions improve, such as rainfall. And this is considered extreme tolerance, and this is a characteristic that is really key to lichen success. However, despite their hardiness, lichens are susceptible to air pollution, and that's because they receive all of their nutrients from the atmosphere, whether from rain or just from uh, you know dry deposition of material. However, that also leaves them susceptible to air pollutants, and the most notable ones are sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and metals. And the effects of air pollution on lichens that are sensitive include element bioaccumulation, tissue damage, and reduction in populations and communities. And these patterns, that is, very few lichens found in areas of polluted areas, have been known for well over 200 years. And they were first noted in a poem by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather and doctor of Charles Darwin. So to give you a few local examples uh, of lichen pollution studies, there is this one incident of a pollution site in Copper Hill, Tennessee, where there was a copper mine and a smelter, copper smelter, and also, believe it or not, a sulfur dioxide plant or a sulfuric acid plant. And they just emitted tons and tons of sulfur dioxide through the years. And during this time in the late 1970s, a student in northern Georgia by the name of Tom Mather, who later became the public information officer for the Division of Air Quality, did a study looking at the lichens along the transect from close to the smelter or the mine site further away east. And this was along Highway 64 in western North Carolina. And what he found was that you have greater macrolichen diversity further away from the source, and beard lichens, which are foliose, fruticose, bushy lichens, are the best indicator of air quality. Um, Another study example was conducted by Jim Lowry of George Mason University, and he did a repeated study or repeated sampling of the rock green shield lichen Flavoparmelia baltimorensis in 3 sites in Maryland and Virginia. And what he did is that he took samples of this lichen, he analyzed them for certain metals, including also sulfur and nitrogen. And he found out that over time, concentrations have reduced, most notably sulfur concentrations within the tissues and lead concentrations. And the lead concentrations are really testament to our regulations of getting lead out of gasoline. So this is a good news how lichens can be used as um, environmental indicators and biomonitors. After joining the Division of Air Quality myself, I was able to conduct a study here in Raleigh, North Carolina, looking at lichens and their communities and how they are affected by population and the urban landscape. So I looked at 17 sites in the Raleigh area, plus a control site over at Mason Farm, and looked at just one species of tree, that is Quercus velos, the willow oak, and looked at the lichen communities, and I numbered the number of species, their abundance and cover, and then compared them against the abiotic environmental um, parameters of parameters of vehicle traffic abundance as well as population density. And what I found out was that there was a strong correlation between population density and even stronger with vehicle traffic in the sites where the lichens were investigated. In other words, in higher traffic or higher densely populated areas, you have fewer lichens. And this is kind of like a surrogate to environmental pollution. So like in more trafficked areas and more densely urban areas, you've got more polluted areas, and therefore you have fewer lichens. However, the lichen species that were found most commonly were already known to be pollution tolerant species, such as the candle flame lichen, this yellow one here, uh, the mealy, the mealy rosette lichen, also this mustard lichen, and a couple of larger macrolichens such as the common green shield lichen and the speckled shield lichen. I followed up this study with my master's thesis at NC State, looking more closely at vehicle traffic and their effects on lichen abundance and diversity. And what I did is that I looked at um, three transects, two of them on either side of I-40 near the RDU airport, and a controlled one along Harris Lake down in southern Wake County. And what I found, and in addition to sampling the lichens and noting the numbers of species in each of these transects, I also was able to measure directly the concentrations of nitrogen oxides or NOx. And what I found out was that NOx was highest concentration closest to the highway, and it tapers off to about 150 meters from the road. And then in a control site, it was barely detectable. And just the opposite I found in lichen numbers, and that is I had only very few species right alongside the highway, yet I had more species as I go further away from the road. And then in the control site, there was twice as many species as were found in the highway sites. And another thing that was interesting was that in the control site, I found cyanolichens, that is, the pollution sensitive lichens that use cyanobacteria as their photobionts, but they were not found in either of the roadway transects. And so with that, we'll come to another stopping point. Um, so I got a few questions here. Where do lichens live? Do they live on trees, on rocks, on abandoned cars, or all the above? And why are lichens vulnerable to air pollution? And we can stop again for some more questions too, if you have any.
Great. We're getting a few responses to your questions in the chat. So if you have a response to Gary's questions, please put them in the chat. And if you have a question you want to ask Gary, please put that in the Q&A. I'll give everybody a moment to answer your question. And while we're waiting on them to think about the right answers, we've got a few for the first one, the multiple choice, saying D, all of the above. I've got a few questions for you. The first one is asking about the evolution of lichens.
Ah, that is an excellent question, and I've always been fascinated by evolution in general. But it has been generally found that there have been a number of lichenization events through time, and different groups of lichens have evolved independently. So, our, um, the oldest lichen fossils date back to about 400 to 600 million years ago, and it is possible that I don't know which forms first came about, but I would surmise that the simplest forms, the crustose lichens, probably first evolved. And then, in some cases, as found within certain lichen families, a crustose has been known to evolve into um, folio species. Does that help?
I think so. All right, we've got a couple more questions. The next one is, are there any lichens identified for traditional healing?
That's a good, I would think so, but none that I am aware of. I know that in some natural herb areas, in natural herb stores, such as in Europe, I think there were some products that involve usnea. And I would suggest, looking around in places like Whole Foods or, national medicinal areas that could have lichen product, herbal remedies. But none that I can say specifically at this point.
All right, and another question similar is, are there any medical applications of lichens at all that you know of?
Right, right.
So outside of traditional herbal type medicine.
That not that I know of, but I do believe that some lichens are being investigated for the antifungal and antibacterial properties because lichens are known to produce chemicals that deter, infections and, herbivory.
All right. Some lichens have little cup-like structures. Can you say more about these?
Yes, absolutely. The cup-like structures are actually the reproductive structures of the fungus, and they comprise of a number of tissues, and they have a great diversity of form and anatomy. And inside the cups are these little microscopic sacs in which which are called asci, in which spores are developed. So you can consider the cup-like structures as the fruiting bodies, and that's where the spores are developed for lichen reproduction.
Interesting. All right. What is the strangest type of lichen that you have seen?
I guess the strangest lichen I would say is probably Flakea papillata. This is a lichen that was really interesting. It wasn't known to biologists until the 1990s, although it's been collected quite a bit before, but people were scratching their heads as to what it was, and they just called it the thing. And it wasn't until molecular analysis was performed that was confirmed that this was indeed a lichen and that it is, they were able to place it within a family, within a, lichen fungus family. This is a species that grows exclusively in deep shaded areas within rock crevices or near water, and is very small and has got little tiny branches. So it's what we call a microfoliose lichen.
Interesting. All right, we've got a couple people have mentioned that they do know of a vendor at the Carborough Farmers Market that sells a tincture of Usnea as immunological support.
Okay.
And we had another question, which I think you've answered. What's the oldest lichen ever found?
Right, that would be a fossil dated 600 million years ago, and I think that was found in China. There were other fossils that were found about that date to about 400 million years ago in Scotland. And there are some other species that date back to the Devonian that are of questionable affinity. Some people think they're lichens, some people think they're just fungi, but no one really knows.
All right, and in response to your question, why are lichens vulnerable to air pollution? We have some answers that lead to that all of their nutrients are received via the air, which makes them then susceptible to pollution.
Excellent. Okay. Um, any more questions or shall we move on?
We just got one more question that just popped in. Is the primary reproduction via spores and incidental algae bacterial colonization or other mechanisms?
It really depends on the species. And some species do rely on spores. And just like he mentioned or she mentioned, the spores, once it's ejected from the fruiting body, lands into a suitable place. And once it hooks up with a alga that's also raining down via the aerial plankton, the magic chemistry happens and a lichen thallus is formed. But yes, there are many lichens that will reproduce asexually, forming small vegetative propagules that will disperse out, and therefore they don't rely on sexual reproduction via spores. However, if they do that, that means the environmental conditions are exceptionally good, and they can expend that extra energy towards spore production.
All right, and we can answer some more questions at the end of the talk.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so now we're going to talk about lichen diversity. As you can tell, we've got quite a few species growing in the world, and only a fraction of them are already been described. So that means there is the potential for discovery, which got piqued my interest in lichenology way back in the 90s. An example of this is this publication that came out in 2011, wherein 100 authors or investigators have published their discoveries of 100 species all in one paper. And one example of these species that was newly discovered was Acarospora jani, or Jana's cobblestone lichen. This was first discovered over in New Mexico, in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and yet it was also found here in North Carolina. And at the time when this paper came out, only those two locations were known. And so we were wondering, why is this? Why do you have such a great disparity both in time and space? Because the original was discovered back in 1820s, whereas the North Carolina I found in 2009. Well, it happens to be that there were many species that were just simply overlooked, and through extra collecting as well as searching through existing collections, they're able to find more representatives of this species, and hence some of the gaps have been filled in. So we may find this to be even more widespread as time moves on. Down in the neotropics, where biodiversity is really running, is known to be very high, it is estimated that about 3,000 species of lichens are yet to be discovered. And people are publishing new species reports from the tropics even to this day. Here in North America, we have a total estimate of over 5,500 species in the United States and Canada. And those are the species that have been described and reported. And we have over 1,000 species reported in several states here in the US, including Alaska, California, and North Carolina. And so the way to track North Carolina's lichen biodiversity, we have partnered with the North Carolina Biodiversity Project in having a lichen page. And you can explore this by going onto this link down here, ncbiodiversity.com, and you can just go onto the homepage and learn about various lichens, and you can put in your name, of a lichen that you're interested in, and find out more about it. Current estimates of the North Carolina lichen biota number about 1,500 species across the state, and about a third of those are based solely on herbarium records, which means that some of these records could be old and could be misidentified. So this number is just an estimate. But looking at the patterns here in the state, the highest diversity is clearly in the mountains, with some high diversity out on the coast and some scattered here in the Piedmont. But really, if you ask me, I think it's more a function of people going out there and exploring these areas as opposed to the actual lichen diversity in in these regions. For instance, Wake County, where I've done a lot of surveys myself, we have over 300 species, and I don't know what happened there. But and also Orange County has a moderately high number too, due to recent collections. In addition to total species count, we also have some rare species that we're concerned about. And these are listed by the Natural Heritage Program in their biannual list of rare plant species of the state. And this is something they put together every 2 years. And as you can tell, the numbers here are already out of date based on the current estimates. So we already have some new numbers, and this is currently in development. And hopefully sometime this year, the 2020 list will be coming out and you'll see the revised numbers. Among vulnerable lichens is the rock gnome lichen, which is the one federally protected endangered species in North Carolina. This is a ground-dwelling fruticose lichen that is found only on rocks in high elevation habitats in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. More locally, we also have a red listed vulnerable species, the Carolina moon lichen. And as you can see from its distribution map, it's found all across the state as well. Again, these blank spots just simply means that it hasn't been collected. We don't know whether it exists there or not. It could. But based on now, so we do have some here in North Carolina and in Orange County and in Durham County. And to give you a brief tour of the lichens here in the triangle, we got some crestose lichens, which include comma lichens, pox lichens, gold dust lichens, and also rim lichens, button lichens, script lichens, and wart lichens. As you can see, all of these crestose lichens share the crestose thallus morphology, but they really vary in their reproductive structures and mode of reproduction. Foliose lichens, we have quite a few also here locally, and these are probably the more showy lichens that you see. Um, and examples include ruffle lichens that typically grow on trees, green shield lichens that grow on trees and rocks. Sorry, let me get back there. Rosette lichens, which also tend to be more pollution sensitive or pollution tolerant, excuse me. And then we have candle flame lichens, which are nitrophilous or pollution loving, and speckled shield lichens and shadow lichens, which are also found on trees. So most of the foliose lichens that you'll see are growing on trees, but we do have a fair number that grow on rocks as well. Fruticose lichens can be found either in the treetops, on branches, or down on the ground. Those that occur in the trees include strap lichens and beard lichens, and those that occur down on the ground include reindeer lichens and various species of cladonias, including British soldiers and pixie cups. Here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, when I do my um, lichen classes in person, I like to give people a tour of a short field trip around the um, Piedmont Nature Trails. And in there, there are three showstoppers that I like to point out to everyone. One of them here is the dog lichen, which is Peltigera canina, and this is noteworthy because this is a cyanolichen and therefore is pollution sensitive. And this tells me that the woods of the Piedmont Trails at the garden are relatively healthy. Another exciting find that Amy Rivas Plata had discovered a few years ago is this Leptotrema glaucescens, known as a smooth pore lichen. And this is also found near meetings of the rivers, meetings of the waters, along a stream stride trail here at the garden. And what's remarkable about this species is that it's only been reported once before from North Carolina, and that is on the coast. So this consists of not only a county record for Orange County, but also a record for the Piedmont. And another species I like to show off is the Fisher lichen, Fischerina insidiosa. This is one that I discovered along one of my class walks just a couple of years ago, and was really excited to see it because I've only seen these out on the coast. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead with a brief summary. Lichens are now known as meta-organisms comprising of multiple partners, not just a fungus and an alga, but bacterial communities and other types of fungi. They are quite variable in growth forms. They're found everywhere. They can handle really harsh conditions, yet they are highly, highly diverse. And despite their extreme tolerance, they are vulnerable to air pollution as well as climate change. Therefore, they can be used as indicators of environmental health, and some species are being protected and noted as rare, and therefore are important for conservation. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending this Lunchbox talk. And if you have any questions, please send me an email, or if you have any lichens found in your yard you'd like to have identified, you can by all means send a sample over to me. Just make sure that it's collected in its dry state. With that, any final questions?
All right, thank you for that, Gary. That was fabulous. We do have a few questions, and we've got time for at least a couple of them. One you've partially answered. Where's the best place to go looking for a variety of lichens? And it sounds like our Piedmont Nature Trails are a great place to find some lichens.
Yes, and actually, because lichens are so diverse here in North Carolina, you can just go into your backyard or local park, because they literally grow everywhere.
Are there any invasive species of lichens?
Not that I'm aware of. We're not really too keen on any introduced lichens. There may be a few species that are known from Europe that have made their way across here, but in general, lichens grow very slowly. And so therefore, I don't think we have really an invasive species issue with lichens.
Question, are lichens allelopathic to nearby plants?
Not that I'm aware of. And I remember one time I was, making some printouts at the local FedEx, and someone had asked me if those are lichens and how can they be, killed or removed. And I said, you don't want to do that because they're not hurting, the plants that they're growing on. They're just merely using that as a substrate. So, in other words, the lichen substances that the fungus produces is an herbivore deterrent, but not necessarily a plant deterrent.
All right. And do lichens help decompose rocks?
If they do so, it is extremely slowly. And that's because lichens themselves are slow growing. And in fact, some lichens are known to grow for thousands of years. And that's primarily because they're, poikiehydric strategies, meaning that under dry conditions, they will just shut down.
All right. Is iNaturalist useful in identifying distributions? Do you want photos from individuals?
Oh, yes, by all means. In fact, I've been teaching a series of online webinars, and we use iNaturalist considerably. And so, yeah, if you want to post your images on iNaturalist, just let me know, and I can take a look and see what I think of them. So, yeah, that'd be great.
All right. And we've got time for just one more question. Can you mention again the title of the lichen key that you recommend?
Oh, yes, yes. And actually, I have a copy of it right here. So if you can see it, this is called Keys to Lichens of North America, Revised and Expanded. And this is by Erwin Brodo, and it was published in 2016.
Great. Thank you for that. We've got some other questions. I'm going to copy them down and we can email them to you. And if you have time to respond to those, we can send those out to the participants.
That would be great.
And I'm going to turn things over to Joanna.
Gary, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and your time with us.
No,
and
thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you involved with the Botanical Garden. So,
great.
And thank all the attendees for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for a future virtual Lunchbox talk. And also, if you're not currently a member, please consider joining as a member. And thank you all again for great questions, for attending with us today. And I look forward to seeing you in our garden.